Okay, it looks like we're live. So I'm Donna Sinclair, and I am here today with Jake Jochim. I am running for state representative in the 18th Legislative District, and Jake is a former student of mine at WSU Vancouver. He's also someone who has a podcast called Say What You Mean with another student, former student. You both are beyond students. Jeff Lopez. Say What You Mean is a podcast in which the two of them get together and talk about their viewpoints, which are have differed pretty significantly at times, and they have learned to discuss issues that they don't necessarily agree on with real civility. And so because of that, I think I know Jake in a way that he may not know, because they talk about a lot of personal issues too. But over the last couple of years, I'd say that we have all become friends versus student and teacher. Jake's also has a program called To the Republic, and so we'll talk about that a little bit later. But I'd like to introduce Jake Jochim, and I thank you for coming on this discussion with me today, Jake. And so with that, I'm just going to go ahead and ask you to tell us about your background and where you come from. And
thank you, Donna, for allowing me to come on this platform. It's honestly a great honor. You're always one of my favorite professors I had in college. I learned so much. I have a lot to talk about in terms of my experience at WSU Vancouver and how that shaped my both my personal and my in my personal life and my education. But I grew up in Vancouver, and I went to Lincoln Elementary and then Discovery Middle School. I graduated from Hudson's Bay High School, so it's just kind of all in this kind of centralized downtown area of Vancouver. Then I went to Clark. My post-secondary education has been quite a journey. It took me a long time to reach my bachelor's degree, which I completed, as you say, I completed at WSU Vancouver. I went to Clark right after high school, and I just wasn't really ready to be a student. And after a couple of semesters of just kind of floundering around, I decided to drop out, and I went to work full time. After a few years, when I was about 23, I decided that it was time. I really wanted to finish my degree, and so I went from there. I went and re-enrolled at Clark, and I finished my associates, and then transferred to Washington State, Vancouver in 2015. After a few years there, I completed my bachelor's in history. Then I've just that's when me and Jeff started Say What You Mean podcast, which was kind of a way for us to continue our education in a way that was fun for us, where we get together every week. It airs every Thursday, and we just talk about current events, about civics, and a lot of times with sports. And as you mentioned, we talk a lot of personalized. Jeff and I have both been through a lot, especially in the last couple of years, and we just kind of get through it. And Jeff is such a wonderful friend. I couldn't ask for a better friend than him, and he's just amazing. And so it's been an honor to be able to do that with him. And then we were approached by KXRW Vancouver, which is a community radio station, which is a sister station to X-Ray FM, which is in Portland. And for us to do a kind of a civic show and as kind of an educational focus. And that meant a lot to both Jeff and I. And so we created To the Republic as a way to, how I've always seen it is we don't want to tell people what to shout about. We just want them to know why they're shouting. And it's just giving them the tools and the knowledge of what are governmental processes. What is the role of government? What does history say about how we got here? And we've tackled subjects like voting. What are the voting rules in the United States? Immigration. We've talked about political norms. Really, we've touched on a lot of things. And then Matt, as Jeff started in his master's degree with communications at Washington State, he kind of took a step back, and then Matt, who you had on, filled in for that role. And so him and I are both kind of international relations nerds. So we kind of took the show in a little bit different direction in talking about international relations and American foreign policy. So that's been a lot of fun. But just, I guess, back to myself, in my personal life, I've spent my whole life in the outdoors, in this region, hunting and fishing. That's been basically the industry I've worked in my whole life. Since I was really old enough to have a job, I've worked at a sporting goods store. primarily at the gun counter, which is one of the things that we were going to discuss today is my experience in that kind of realm, and then the knowledge that I have in a very hot button issue in our country right now. So that's in just my attachment both to hunting, but then also conservation. Conservation is such a big part in my life. I belong to several different conservation organizations like Ducks Unlimited and Delta Waterfowl, and a local conservation organization called Oregon Duck Hunters Association. So preserving public lands and preserving habitat is something that is really, really important to me, especially at the salmon runs, because our local economy is so dependent on salmon, and has been, since this area was settled, and even with the Native American culture, salmon was such a huge part of this region's history. So that's something that's really, really important to me. So yeah, that's basically kind of me in a nutshell, I guess.
I think there's a lot more to you than that, Jake. I mean, that's one of the things that I've learned, in particular from listening to Say What You Mean, is that you are a really deep thinker and you're very thoughtful. And that's part of the reason that I wanted to invite you, not just your experience in the sporting goods store, which I think will be really interesting for people to hear about. But I also know that you came into WSU Vancouver, and that you come from a pretty conservative background. And one of the things I was going to ask you about was sort of the development of your political thinking along with your education, because I know that those are things that sort of overlap. And the reason I say that I've learned more about you in listening to Say What You Mean is you were very quiet in class. And so I didn't get to talk to you as much. And sometimes I'll hear you talk about something that we talked about in class, and I'm like, Jake, you always remember these things too. So thank you for that.
So I came into to Washington State as someone who identified as a staunch Republican, and without really knowing what that meant. And so one of the things that education gave me is the comfortable environment to have my held beliefs challenged. And that really began my first semester at Washington State. The faculty there at that institution is they're fantastic. Both yourself, Dr. Peabody, Dr. Lopez, have been so just foundational in this transformation in my thinking. And that's not to say that I still don't see myself as a Republican and as a conservative. I just know why I believe more now than I did when I started education. And there's things I've changed my mind on, and things I've moved off of. And but education was such a positive experience in my life, and I would never change that at all. And so especially in as far as like social issues go, that's something I've definitely changed a lot. And I think when you're confronted with information, you either can block it off, or you can accept it and change your view. And that's one thing that I definitely learned from your classes, was the ability to do that, and learning, especially with the regional history of our area and the role of federalism. And I know you and I talked about this the last time Jeff and I went to your class to talk about podcasting, was like the role of federalism in the relationship between the federal government and the states. That changed so much after taking classes of yours, because I had such a different view, or not a clear understanding of that relationship and how that's changed over time. And getting that information, especially how the federal government's expansion through the Dry Lands Act and the Railroads Act and the Homestead Act, how that fundamentally changed our region, but then also how environment and how federal policy shapes environment, and how that changed migration patterns of Americans, and how we all ended up here. And it's just how all that connected really opened my mind to having such a better and more thorough understanding of just us as individuals, and then also us as Americans. And that's just one of the many ways in which my education through the Washington state system really changed.
Well, I really like that when you do say what you mean and to the Republic, that that you and Jake and Matt, that you read articles and you talk about ideas and you take them apart and get down to the core of what people are talking about. And you all challenge each other to move beyond your original assumptions, which I think is the value of education. And I think it's interesting that for you coming into WSU, identifying as a conservative Republican, that it's important to identify why you believe what you believe, and that you have been able to change some of your beliefs and to become stronger in others and have the foundational reasons for that, so that you can have discussions. And I think that's exactly what education should do. So I appreciate that, because we hear a lot about how the universities are bastions of liberal mind washing and brainwashing, and that's not the case.
No, not at all. And I've had that kind of thrown at me by various individuals over the years. And that's something I always, like, I say, like, in my experience, I didn't at one time feel uncomfortable about expressing my opinions openly in the classroom. No, I didn't talk a lot for other reasons, but I never felt like I couldn't say what I wanted to say. And that was it was so instrumental in me being comfortable to change, because one of the things, like, probably the moment I can pinpoint when I started to really grow and mature both as a student and as an individual is when I kind of said to myself, it's okay to not be a Republican. And then when I kind of accepted that, I think is when I really kind of became one, because I knew why I believed, and I was okay to change. And if I'm not that anymore, like, that was one of the things. It's like one of the things just growing up is, like, I felt like because I allowed, like, my opinion and my identity to then drive how I thought about things. It's like, okay, well, here's an issue. I'm a Republican, so here's how I feel about it. Instead of what education allowed me to do was flip that and say, okay, here's an issue. What's the information? And then here's my opinion. And if that differs from the party, or that differs from what the narrative is from the media that I generally consume, well, then there's a schism there. And then I just feel like I go through more of that research, going about every single issue as a research project. I think really helps me get down to the core of any particular issue. And I love applying theories to everything. I don't know if you've listened to the most, like, recent episode of Say What We Mean. We talk about Tragedy of the Commons and the Malthusian Trap, and how that influences different policies or different political thinking. And I just love all of that kind of stuff, and that's just what really always excites me.
So it sounds to me like you have an independent leaning, because of that kind of analysis, so that you're not choosing one side or the other to tell you what to think, but that you're deciding what to think and figuring out where it fits for yourself, which I think is a really good approach.
I think so too. And it's hard, because politics, we get told so often that politics is a team sport, or at least that's kind of like the assumption is that it's you're either on one side or the other. And we can reject that assumption. Like, it doesn't have to be we don't have to fall into that dichotomy. We can reject it, and I don't know, not see compromise as weakness, and actually reach across the aisle and talk to people that we don't necessarily agree with, and because that's the foundation of a democracy.
Right. Well, I could talk to you about this topic all day long. I know, pretty easily, because this is, it's interesting. It's interesting for us to kind of examine where we're coming from. And I'll ask you one more question about that, and then let's move on a little bit. But the question is, you said that you've identified that you feel like you became a Republican by identifying the things that you believe. So what are those things that make you feel that way?
Well, for really, it's as I went through school and then started graduate studies in political science, international relations. I began to identify less and less hills that I was willing to just die on, and understand that there's a lot of nuance and there's a lot of compromise that goes with pretty much any issue, especially when you're talking about governance. And but for me, like some of the core issues that, like when I'm looking at a party's platform or a candidate's platform and the policies that they're hoping to implement if they were elected, and that I kind of, in looking at some of like the core Republican stances, and reason why I think I at least historically would align more with that party, would be uh, free trade in foreign policy. And I've and this is because I, with the use of tariffs and the use of quotas and stuff like that, and even though, like, you know, Herbert Hoover was a Republican and he instituted some of the most restrictive tariffs in our country's history, but the the topic of free trade, prohibitive military, America's role abroad, as kind of as like a hegemon and world leader, through created institutions like the UN, the World Trade Organization, International Monetary Fund, stuff like that. And then I'm also Republican because I support well, not as much. Well, I think this is a good transition into probably what the next topic is, which is firearm legislation. But because of their historical stance on gun control, although I can't fully support their kind of zero sum ideology when it comes to firearm legislation anymore, but historically, that's one of the reasons why I've aligned with the party.
Okay, well, go ahead and talk about that. I think that is a good transition.
Mm-hmm.
I'm interested in hearing. I think one of the questions I sent you was, you can talk either about working at the gun counter, as you have. I think you've got great stories there, and I'm not sure how many of those you want to tell. But I think that does actually tie into the question that I asked you, which was, what did you see as the sort of the positives and negatives of I-1639? What do you think about I-1639? I think maybe that's just broadly, because I've heard you talk about it and refer to it before, and we were going to sit down and talk about this several months ago, and then COVID hit. We were going to have coffee, so now we're just doing it publicly.
Doing it publicly, right?
Yeah,
yeah.
Which I think is fine.
Yeah, so I-1639, was passed in 2018 and went into effect in mid 2019. It, gosh, that was such the information that was out about that bill. There was so much misleading information being put out by, and I hate putting people into camps because I don't know if there's really people, like I could say the gun control camp and then the pro 2A, pro Second Amendment camp, but there's such a spectrum there. But from a lot of the people heading the opposition to I-1639 put out a lot of, well, misleading information, and some of that was really easily, just by reading through the bill, you could really pick through a lot of it. And one of the biggest points of contention was the narrative surrounding part of the bill, which was like the safe storage provision, which requires that if there's somebody if you allow someone access to your home, and you have firearms in the home, but if you allow someone access who doesn't have the legal right to own them, and they go and they get access to those firearms if they weren't locked up, and then use those firearms in a crime, the owners of those firearms could be held liable up to I think it's a Class C felony. And the narrative that was put out was that if someone breaks into your home and steals your firearms and uses those firearms in a crime, you're held liable. And that just wasn't true about the bill. The bill specifically stated in the official wording of the document of the law that was passed, that your homeowners are protected from illegal break-in. It's only if you allow access to your home to somebody who can't legally use them, and they gain access to those firearms, having them not been locked up, that then you can then be prosecuted for. So there's very, very narrow set of circumstances that you could be prosecuted for. But it was definitely misrepresented And that was one of the parts that I actually agree with the safe storage provision, because I think that you can look just anecdotally at a few of the mass shootings that we've had in this country and point to where if firearms had been properly stored, it could have prevented a tragedy. So I don't necessarily, I actually with, and then, but also the protection that was put into to private homeowners to protecting them against illegal break-in, I think was necessary. And I think that that being included showed a lot of foresight by the writers of that law. And so I definitely supported, that was one of the areas where there was misinformation, but as a gun owner myself, I supported that particular part of the bill.
Because you're supposed to, if something happens and your gun is stolen, you report it to the police and then you're no longer liable, right?
Yeah,
But
so
if, for example, I remember when I was in sixth or seventh grade, there were a couple of kids at the school. I must have been in seventh grade because I had moved, and the school that I had been at, which was Burton Elementary, there had been a shooting where there was a kid who got one of his father's firearm and shot his friend and killed his friend. And he didn't mean to, it was accidental, right? And so, but that in this case, that person could be held liable because of 1639 for not locking it up, correct?
If
I know
so
you're not a lawyer yet, but
that's a gray area because well, I guess it would be because the kid legally couldn't possess the firearm and gained access to it. So yeah, under 1639, my understanding of the bill, with the caveat that I'm not a lawyer,
or neither am I. I'm a historian. You're right.
Would be that the homeowner, the owner of the firearm would be liable in that situation. And I think it creates an incentive to lock up your firearms. And I think that we all have the Second Amendment gives us all the right to own a firearm, provided that we meet certain standards. And I think that with that right becomes responsibility. And I think that having incentive to take that responsibility seriously is I think needed, because at this point we see that there is a massive problem both with accidental discharges leading to fatalities, and then also evil acts of perpetrated by people with all sorts of different mental health issues that are causing these tragedies that has really become an epidemic in our country.
What would you say are the problems with, or I guess, first of all, are there any other things that you see as beneficial to 1639? And what do you see as the problems with 1639? And I just want to preface that with saying, I remember when it was the initiative was underway, that you said that you had actually printed out the initiative because you had so many people coming into the store and just perpetuating these myths, and that you would hand it to them and say, here's what it says. As I recall you talking about that.
I did, yeah. I even highlighted and circled the sections that were mostly talked about, and that's the safe storage provision was by far the most talked about of that bill. And then it shifted over. That shifted over time. The complaints with the bill shifted over time. And one of the other things that I agree with the bill on is that it's not perfect, but it does at least set, and Washington's bill is unique in this, and I haven't found this in any other states' proposed firearm legislation, is that having mental health become a part of the process in determining, it can be brought through the right institutional processes. It can be brought into the background check process. So through one of the provisions of the bill, if the person conducting the background check or the state entity, like a sheriff's, the county sheriff, ultimately for handgun purchases, and now with the state is defined as assault rifles, if they sign off on it, and then it goes to they can then pull the health records of somebody who's attempting to purchase a firearm if it's deemed that it's pertinent to the background check process. And then the HIPAA records are then released for that specific purpose and then become resealed. So it's not just something that then just becomes public information, which is one of the biggest points of contention, is that everybody who purchases a firearm, they waive their HIPAA rights. And that's just not really the case. There's far more nuance in the bill in relation to that particular provision. One of the things.
So did you vote for it, Jake? Is that okay if I ask you if you voted
that's
for it?
fine. I did not. I ended up not voting for it, mostly because I felt that it, as much as it did, I keep talking about the bill and it did two really good things. I think overall, I didn't vote for it because I think what it ended up doing arbitrarily is it arbitrarily put association of firearms into this class of assault rifle, that I felt was a bit of a reach in. So for instance, anything that's a semi-automatic weapon, that means that's one round fired per pull of the trigger, and then the mechanics of the action will then cycle the action, taking rounds from a magazine, putting it into the chamber, and then every time you pull it, it cycles itself. It's not fully automatic, which would you just hold the trigger down and then it keeps shooting until you're out of ammunition. Those guns are legal, but through a very, very, very strict process through Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. Anyway, but at all semi-automatic rifles were deemed assault rifles, and then so anybody couldn't purchase one unless you're 21, and you have to take a state-sanctioned class in order to purchase those. And then there's a $10 weight, and then there's right now it's at $18, an $18 background check tax that's then associated with the purchasing of these guns. And as much as, like, because the assault rifle, like the kind of the poster child for what is considered an assault rifle is like the AR-15 or the AK-47. But put into that would be any sort of form of semi-automatic hunting rifle, 22 caliber target rifles. I thought they didn't. The crafters of the legislation didn't do a good enough job of making certain distinctions that I thought were needed to put this. If you're going to then just blanketly, I thought it was too general in its conceptualization or its definition of assault rifles, and I thought that was a bit of an overreach. And then I didn't like that the state created its own background check system, because the store that I work at is in Oregon, which already does its own background checks, and that background check system becomes so bogged down, and it's creating, especially now with how many firearms are being purchased, it's taking such a long time to get responses. Like right now, we had over 5,000 people in the queue to have their background checks looked at in the state of Oregon. In Washington was even worse because they were still trying to implement their background check system here. So normally what Washington used to do prior to I-1639 is that they would gather all the information. They gathered information that was filled out on the federal firearm background check, and then that would get put through the federal system, and then the feds, the fixed system, would kick back an approval number, and the person could leave with the firearm. Now Washington State is doing their own checks, and it doesn't have the resources to be able to conduct that thoroughly. So if there's anything that's like, so let's say the person moved there, we run into this all the time in Oregon, is that if a person has had an incident or something that is flagging Oregon State system that happened in another state, they then have to go and contact the either state, local, or county entity to acquire the appropriate paperwork that then clears that person to purchase them. And the state of Oregon just doesn't have the weight of the federal government, and it can create month-long delays for anything that can be as simple as like a speeding ticket that didn't get resolved in Kansas 20 years ago. And so that's an extreme example, but we see it quite a bit in Washington State. And I wish that Washington had stayed. But the argument was that Washington could do a more thorough check, and that might be true. I don't know the statistics on that, but I know that how Oregon's experience with its own internal check, it created such a long, drawn out process. I knew what the pitfall. I just kind of assumed what the pitfalls were going to be, and so far I've been kind of right on how that was going to play out. So that was one of the other reasons why I didn't like the bill to begin. I didn't really like the bill, and I wish that further firearm legislation would pick the good things from I-1639 and then build off of those. But it ultimately, I-1639 did pass with 20% of the vote. Well, it passed by a margin of 20%. So obviously, it was liked by the Washington State voters. So
Well,
anymore.
so do you actually do the background checks as in your store? Does that come through? Because I know where my father lives in New Hampshire, that when he got a handgun, he had to go down to it's a very small town. He had to go down to the local police department and register his gun there. So of course there's different laws in different states. And
Yeah.
yeah.
So with Washington and Oregon both, I've purchased and conducted background checks in both states. The with Washington specifically, you do you fill out well, no matter what you're purchasing, it starts at the counter that you're the federal firearms license dealer that you're buying the firearm from, and you fill out what's called the 4473, which is the federal background check document, and all that information gets put electronically into the state, at least with Oregon and Washington, because they have their own background check databases. You input all of that information into the state database, and then it gets uploaded that way, and then they run the check, and then it kicks back an approval number. With Washington, there has to be, with handgun purchases, the county sheriff has to sign off on it. So that's where like having a concealed weapons permit in the state of Washington can bypass the mandatory 10-day wait on handguns if you have a state issued concealed weapons permit. Oregon doesn't have any waiting period on any firearm purchases, regardless of the type. So there's some differences there, but you don't have to directly go to another entity to register or conduct a background check. It's done right there at the counter, and that's one thing that I do as part of my job is to help the customer fill out that form, and then I input it into the state database.
So one of the questions I asked you about right before we got on was about HB 2497, I believe I told you, 2467, establishing a background check system for firearms transfers.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts about that? One person transferring to another. What are your thoughts about that? So that was in the Washington State Legislature last year, and it's something my opponent voted against.
Okay. Yeah, I think that as far as like background checks on transfers go, it's been really demonized, but personally, I don't really see that there's a huge issue with it, because what it essentially does is that if you're a private citizen and you want to sell a firearm to somebody who is not a close family member, you have to go to a federal firearms license dealer and have a background check conducted on the purchaser. And we do those in Oregon, and then Washington has a very similar bill. Washington's bill actually passed before Oregon, and then Oregon kind of mimicked the same thing. Anyway, I think having that's what when politicians, you heard this a lot during the Obama administration, closing the gun show loophole. That's what it means, is that prior to these bills passing in the state legislatures, or I guess in Washington, it was a state bill, but before that there was something that dealt with transfers that was on the Washington state ballot back in, I think it was 2015. And anyway, but federally there's no requirement, so it's a state by state basis. And so when they're talking about closing the gun show loophole, in states that don't have this legislation, you could basically go to a gun show or over the internet. There's several different forums where you can buy and sell used firearms. And basically, if you can just meet in a parking lot, and one person gives cash, the other person gives the gun, and then that's all that's required. But in Washington, Oregon now, you have to go, in order to do that, if you're going to sell to somebody, the way Washington's bill is written, anybody who is more extended than a first cousin, you have to go and do that private party transfer, which would be having a background check conducted.
Yeah, so you would be in support of that. Okay, that's what I thought, but I appreciate you explaining it to me.
Yeah.
The other question that I had was about ghost guns. So I think I told you that there was another law that was passed 2 years ago that actually banned ghost guns. And I know that you can get what was the term that you used? There's a piece of it that can be, because there was a big 60 minutes expose on it recently too. I don't know if you saw that, but it was pretty interesting. But these days people can make them with digital printers. And so that was another bill that was it was the banning of them was passed in the Washington State Legislature 2 years ago.
Okay. Yeah, ghost guns, there's two kind of ghost guns can either, I've heard it used to describe two different things. One, it's like the 3D printing of firearms, which usually they're very, very crude, crudely built, single shot, almost look like rubber band guns. They're honestly, they look kind of like they basically look like a toy gun. I've seen them before. And those can basically get built just off a schematic that you download off of the internet, and then if you have a 3D printer, you can create it. And I know that was both a federal issue about banning those, and Washington State took the step of banning them within the state of Washington. The other way I've used ghost guns described is there's with an AR-15, which is kind of like like I said, the kind of the poster gun for the first assault rifle. There's multiple pieces to the gun, and the only part that has a serial number on it is the lower receiver. And you can buy just the lower receiver because the military used that design, and then that schematic has been it's a mil spec design, so it's the standard design across any platform, and so anybody can build these lowers to then build the AR-15 rifle. Well, in order to be able to complete the firearm, you have to buy the lower receiver, which is the only serial number part on the firearm. And that's considered the firearm. And we sell just strip lowers for people who want to build their own AR-15s. But the loophole kind of with this kind of ghost gun loophole is that you can buy what is called like an 80% lower receiver offline that is basically built all except for one part, or one, you have to basically drill out a certain part of the receiver. And so if you have the tools at home, you can buy these 80% lowers and then finish it yourself at home, and then build the rest of the gun by ordering all the rest of the parts online, the upper receiver, the barrel, trigger assemblies, buffer tube and buttstock, all the stuff that you would need to complete the firearm. And the serial numbered, and therefore it's not trackable in any way. And the way the federal law is written is that you don't have to, as long as you aren't selling those once you've completed that gun without the serial number off that 80% lower, as long as you're only using it for your own personal use, you don't have to have it serial numbered, and you won't get in trouble for not having a federal firearms license for selling those. So as long as it's private use, you're not violating the law. But it's also rife with abuse because there's really no way to track these guns, and even if they're being sold illegally, there's really no way to enforce it if these 80% lowers are being sold.
So the federal law essentially makes it possible as long as you're not selling it, or okay, all right, that's what I thought, but I really appreciate the clarification. Yeah. I know that you're really mired in all of this with the work that you've been doing. How long have you been working at the place that you work?
12 years.
12 years. So yes, you know this stuff inside and out.
I was selling guns before I could legally actually buy one.
That's funny. I was a waitress, and I remember in Massachusetts, I would have to get somebody to carry a glass of wine for me to the table until I turned 18. But then from 18 to 21, I could do it. Anyway, yeah. So that's kind of an interesting phenomenon, right?
Yeah, I had to carry a card around with me in my wallet that with my parents' permission to sell firearms until I was 21.
Oh my gosh, that's funny, Jake. Well, one of the things we're already I knew this was going to happen because we're both good at talking. One of the other things we were going to talk about, so you returned to school for a while, and you went into international policy, and you're taking a break now. And I think you wanted to talk a little bit about mental health issues, because I mean, you brought it up in relation to guns, and I think in a very reasonable way, but why don't you just go ahead and talk about some of the issues that you've been grappling with?
Yeah, so I've been pretty open on my social media, which is why I don't have an issue talking about it here, is that I've struggled with anxiety and depression for most of my life, and I didn't get help for that for a long time. It was actually only the last couple of months that I've actually taken the steps to get the help that I need clinically. Through medication and therapy, and I ended up in an inpatient program a couple months ago, and that has been kind of like the start of a new life for me. And dealing with really trying to deal with these issues that I think there's a lot of people who deal with them, and that's one thing that being open about my my medical, my behavioral health, is that there's a lot of it almost opens the door to this community of a lot of people who also don't really talk about it, but getting just the waves of support that I've had from people from all throughout my life, just talking about their experiences with it, has just been so positive. And that's one of the things so I start, like you mentioned, I had started a master's program in international relations through American University, which was just getting accepted to American. That was like my dream school, and the School of International Service. And I always wanted to work for the State Department. And then it just got to the point where I couldn't focus on school. I had just hit rock bottom, and I had to withdraw. And that was just one of the toughest decisions, to kind of walk away from my dream, but then also, try to focus on myself, and figure out what it is that I need and what I want. And there's been a lot of upheaval and turnover in my life, but ultimately that's been it's something that I'm working through. And that's one of the things that I kind of wanted to I guess talk to you about, because you had asked me about kind of some of the things that I think the question was about what what I would like to see from you if you were elected to Washington State Congress. And I think one of the things where I didn't know it was available, but the mental health facilities in Southwest Washington, there's Rainier Springs, which is where I did my inpatient and then my partial hospitalization. There's not a ton of access to those facilities throughout Washington State, and I think that that's an area where I think the legislature could help give funding or research to more mental health issues. And I think that's something that's really important. It's really important to me, in addition to like the conservation that I had talked about earlier. But it's just getting kind of ending the stigma and addressing mental health at the state level, I think would go a long way to fixing a lot of these kind of more systemic issues that we're seeing with firearms and alcohol and drug abuse in our society.
I really appreciate that. I know that you decided to take medication and are engaged in a lot of other things, including your photography, which I think is great. So for anybody who saw the announcement that we put out, that's one of your photographs with the yellow umbrella that indicates kind of a new life, right?
Mm-hmm. Hope for a better future. If you're interested in seeing that, you can go on my social media. And I talk at length about each image in the series that I created. And that was just kind of a way of me coping and opening up about this issue that I dealt with a long time. And that was something else that I wanted to talk to, because I've hit kind of two low points in my life. And the first time was when I was at WSU Vancouver, and I was actually taking two of your classes at the time, and I was failing. I was failing your two classes. And when I reached out to you, and I kind of explained to you what was going on, and you helped me, and you gave me the ability to come back in those classes. And I'll never forget that. You're so helping, your support. And you didn't even know me, because I was just the kid that sat in the back of the class that didn't talk. But your willingness to be flexible and to help me, it was just so amazing, Donna. And I can't even begin to thank you enough. I don't think I've ever talked about or told anybody how much that you really helped me then. And that's just one of the reasons why I know that you'll be just a great state representative, is because you do care. Like you care so much about the people just all around you. And the like I said, the support and the help that you gave me, was just amazing. And it was, I can't even begin to just thank you enough for that.
I appreciate that, Jake. I just, you should know. And I remember thinking at the time, and I'll say this here for anybody who's watching, I went through a period of really severe depression about 2 years after I got divorced, and I had 3 little kids, and I was going to school, and I got to the point where I literally could not read. Like I couldn't. And for me, I've been a reader all my life, and I know you are too. And I just couldn't comprehend. And it was a horrible, horrible feeling. And my mother came and took care of things for a little while and got me some help and got me some medication. And so mental health is something that we do need to talk about, all of us. We need to talk about more. We have people in our families. If it isn't us, we know people, we have friends, family members who deal with mental health issues and depression. And so when you reached out to me, I think you sent me an email. Yeah, of course. I wanted to make sure that you had that break. I have had professors who gave me a break here and there. And so I try to pay that forward and make sure that, that the support systems are in place. And so I just want you to know that when it comes to what your future plans are, that you are nowhere near done. You're still very young. I did not finish my PhD till I was 50. So, you know, as you move forward and figure out what you want to do, I would encourage you to pursue those things. Somebody said something to me after I had another major issue in my life and I was in graduate school. A friend of mine said to me, why don't you take a class and see if it energizes you? And if it energizes you, then you can do it again. But if it's too hard because you're worried about all of these things that you're grappling with, then don't do it. And so I did that. I took a class and then I took another one and then I ultimately finished my PhD. So one step at a time. I think that's my recommendation there. Just one step at a time.
That kind of reminds me of how I ended up going back to school. I remember when I went back to Clark, I took one class and then I took two, and then I ended up going back full time. But you're right. I think it's starting or restarting your educational journey. You have to be in the right spot and the right mindset, and you have to want to be there. And I think you're exactly right. And at the moment, I'm taking a break, but it's definitely something I want to return to, whether it's education, or it's following that dream of internet, working for the State Department or something like that. I just want to serve. I know, like you, I just have had this calling to serve, and that's just something that I want to pursue in some avenue. What that avenue is, I'm not sure, but I know that's the best way to kind of pick the path to go is, understanding where we all came from. And that's why I love history, is that it teaches you where we came from.
Same here, right? Well, do you have any questions for me or anything to add? I could keep talking to you all day. Again, I do want to say, I think of you, and I've thought of this many times, Jake, when you've been on the podcast. I definitely see the professor in you. So regardless, I know that wherever you go, that there will be, whether you're a supervisor in the FBI or the State Department, or you become a political science professor, that there will be an element of teacher and service in whatever you do.
Well, thank you. That means a lot, because I look up to you so much. And you really are an inspiration. And I loved having you. You've been on 2 episodes of Say What You Mean, I think, and I think 1 episode of To the Republic, and those are some of my favorite moments in those shows is time running. But I think the one question I had, I guess it's something that for me, and I'm sure there's a lot of other people out there, but is like, what advice would you give people who want to make a difference in their community, or just want to be politically active but don't know how?
Oh, I love that. Is such a great question. I would say to start by engaging with some of the Facebook groups. I think I invited you to a couple of things, the Forum for Clark County Citizens and the Clark County Citizens for Good Governance. Start with local issues. And what happened for me is I resolved to do something political each day. So it might be read something, it might be write a letter to the editor, call my representative. I ended up getting involved with Indivisible Greater Vancouver, which is a wonderful group of people who care about democracy, and who want to hold representatives accountable, make sure that there's transparency in government. That's really one of the major goals. And then I think probably after I started all of that, then I started going to some Democratic Party meetings. My local legislative district, get to know the people who are actually engaged in democratic activity. A lot of people have ideas about what's happening in the world that are not based on the work that's actually being done. And so if you want to know what's happening, then you have to be in contact with those people who are doing the work. And then you have an informed opinion. And you may still think it's all messed up and crazy, but there are a lot of people out there, in my experience, who care about democracy, who are working really hard, and they're doing this at every level. They're doing it on commissions and boards and at the city and the county and the state level and at the federal level. There are people who really care. Now, I don't know where it goes bad. I mean, we all know that there's a lot of corruption too. So, you know, whatever you do, maintain your integrity and don't engage with anything that doesn't support your values. I mean, that's how I've decided to do it. I'm not going to, I will not take money from corporations that don't support my values. I'm just not going to do that, even if it means I lose. So, but make a phone call, write a letter, talk to somebody, read something. Those are the things I was like, come to. You know what? Tonight is the Clark County Democratic meeting, although not going to the meetings in person is kind of tough. They're just not, they're not the same because you don't get to know people in the same way. But the local legislative districts, I think that's a good way to start. Become a precinct committee officer. So there's just a lot of things you can do.
Yeah, thank you for pointing those out, because there's so many avenues I never thought of, and I'm sure there's a lot of people who haven't even thought of different ways that they can make a difference, because we need more good people in politics, and I'm glad you're running, Donna. I really am. I'm excited for November, and anyway, so yeah,
Thank you, Jake.
I wish you the best of luck, and I really do hope you win.
I appreciate that. I really do. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to stop recording here and stop our